When installing an intake manifold, the carburetor, and the air cleaner on an Evolution Harley-Davidson motorcycle, you have to be mindful of a few things to avoid intake leaks. And the intake leaks can happen at these flanges here, at this gasket right here where the carburetor attaches, and at the junction between the carburetor and the carburetor support bracket where there's another gasket. To avoid intake leaks, what we need to do is mount the intake manifold loosely like this. So right now I have all the gaskets in place and the screws are finger tight. The gaskets that I'm using here are used gaskets, not because I'm going to use them in the final installation, but because I don't want to compress and damage the new gaskets as I'm trying to figure out whether or not my carburetor support bracket fits. So once you install the manifold loosely, we need to install the carburetor, and if this gasket is dry, the carburetor is not going to go in. I'm going to use P80 rubber assembly lubricant. Conveniently, I have it in this little container. So I'm just gonna put a couple of drops on the rubber gasket and install the carb. Just gonna make sure that it's all the way in. I'm gonna work it in. That feels pretty good. So the next thing we need to do is make sure that the carburetor is as Harley-Davidson intended it to be. And there's a couple of ways to do that. The easiest way is to use the induction system alignment bracket that Harley used to make, and now they're no longer available, unfortunately. Here's the part number, if you can find this thing online somewhere or on eBay. And if you can't, we'll go over a different way to do this. The bracket works for twin cam 88s, whether they're fuel injected or carbureted. It also works for bottom breather EVOs like this one. And so this is a bottom breather. These holes, the threaded holes, are only for supporting the carburetor support bracket, nothing else. There's no umbrella valves behind them, no oil coming out of here. So the only thing that I'm concerned with here is spacing. If you have a head breather, then you also need to worry about some sealing issues. But here we're just worried about spacing. By the way, this bracket only works for big twins. Does not fit Sportsters, but at any rate, we'll talk about what to do if you don't have one of these. So what we're going to do is we're going to install this bracket onto the carburetor. And the bracket has little dowels that are going to fit into the face of the carb, like so. But right now we're a little bit off because these holes don't align. So we're going to have to twist the carb to make sure that it actually aligns properly. And now we're going to install the support bolts. Just hand tight. Make sure that the carburetor is flush with the bracket. So that's the position that the carb is supposed to be in. So now we have to retain the carburetor in this position, and for that we're going to have to tighten up the manifold screws. And again, this is just a trial fit, so we don't have to do it terribly tight. I just want to make sure that I tighten them sufficiently for the carburetor to stay in place, and then I can trial fit the bracket on and see how that fits. That takes a 1/4 inch hex. And you can see on this side, it's a relatively simple arrangement as far as the tools are concerned. So you can just tighten these guys up very easily. Access is good or decent. And again, I'm not doing it too tight, just kind of snug. And now we need to go on the other side and tighten up the flange on the other side of the motorcycle, which is a little bit more difficult. So you can see that access here is quite poor. There's really not much room to work. So it helps to get a little creative with your tools. and I actually made this little hex bit out of a hex key. I just cut off a piece, and it's a very short piece. I'm going to use this little ratchet right here, and you can see that whatever remains here is just enough to fit into these heads. So right now the screws are turned in by hand. So what I'm going to do is use this ratchet to tighten the screws. But that's why the hex had to be so short. So we'll be able to actually get in here. So the ratcheting action also helps. And again, I don't have to get it terribly tight here. So we're good to go. Now we're gonna go to the other side, take care of that. And that's sufficiently snug. Sometimes they don't want to come out, so you just have to kind of pull it out this way. When I'm going to be tightening everything, I'll probably use a wrench like this. And you can see it has a good head with a kind of a deep recess and grabs the hex really well. So that's going to be used to get the final torque, if I need more torque. Okay, so let's go back on the other side. All we need to do is finish off this screw right here. Okay, so at this point we can remove the induction alignment bracket. And proceed with the fitting of the carburetor support bracket. By the way, if you don't have the induction system alignment bracket, what you can do is just use an angle finder. Okay, so at this point we're going to install the support bracket. And what I wanted to do is show you a couple of different situations that you could have. Depending on the kit that you use, everything changes. So for example, I'm going to be trying to use this TC Brothers support bracket. Here's a part number. And this bracket is for 1989 through 1999 Evo Big Twins. Before I even start installing it, I just want to show you another thing too. So you have to make sure that whatever hardware you have, so let's say that I'm going to be using these bolts or screws to install. Let's just run this down. So I have one of these washers that was provided in the TC Brothers kit, I believe. You can see if I run the screw all the way down, actually it doesn't fasten anything. So I'm going to have to shim it up, or you can use a shorter screw. Okay, now that we've taken care of this, let's install the bracket onto the carb. And we can use, depending on what the situation is, different types of gaskets. So for example, you can see I have two gaskets here in my hand. This is from James, and this came in the TC Brothers kit. The James gaskets are thicker and a lot sturdier. Here's the part number. In some cases you'll need a thicker gasket, in some cases you'll need a thinner one. So why don't we install our bracket onto the carb. I'm going to put the gasket in like this. And again, this is just a trial run. We don't have to grease anything up or worry about sealing right now at all. Just making sure that everything fits. And here we also have the base for the air cleaner. I'm not worried about that right now because all I'm worried about is the spacing between the carburetor and the carburetor support bracket. So let's put the hardware in. Again, that's not exactly how it goes, but for our purposes, it's just fine. There's 3 screws. This hole is for the float bolt vent right here. Just run these guys in and see what happens. This is moving the carburetor a little bit. So this is telling me that the spacing here, the legs here, are a little bit too long. So what's going to happen now, if I continue to tighten these, it's actually going to pull the carburetor a little bit out of my gasket over there. And a little bit is okay, but as I'm looking here, we got quite a bit of space. So I don't know if this bracket is an ideal bracket in this particular case, but I just wanted to show you something else here. So if that's, let's say that this bracket were usable as far as this gap is concerned. If I were to use these screws in these locations, I would want to locate this bracket more positively relative to the heads here, because the bracket is supposed to support the carburetor, and if you have that much play here, it'll just slip down or up or whatever. So in this particular case, what you would do is use a spacer kit like this, and this is from Drag Specialties. Here's the part number right here. And the kit contains a variety of washers with flanges, and the washers have different IDs, and the flanges have different lengths. But in this particular case, and I'm just going to demonstrate on another bracket, you insert the washer like this, and you can see it doesn't protrude all the way through. So you can have a nice flush mount here, and then you would use another steel washer to back it up like this, and then you could essentially install your screw this way. And so now the bracket can't really move up and down very much at all relative to the head. But I really don't like the gap that I'm having right now between the bracket and the carburetor. So what do you do? You can try a different bracket. It's surprising how brackets that are meant for the same, essentially the same application, can have quite different dimensions. So let me show you another bracket here that I have. And this bracket is, I believe, from GNP Cycles. Let me see if I have the part number. And yes, I do. This is a skew. I don't know if it's visible in this comparison. These legs are a lot shorter on the GNP Cycles bracket than the TC Brothers bracket. So let's see if we can install the GNP Cycles bracket now. And again, I'm going to use a thick gasket because I'm worried about the length of these legs. What if they're still too long? Okay, so now let's see what happens here. Now we're all the way snug against the carb. We're not pulling the carburetor out of the intake manifold, so that's fine. So as you can see, all these brackets are made slightly differently. This pretty much should cover the various situations that folks run into when they install the intake manifold, the carburetor, and the air cleaner. Of course, there are many different types of air cleaners on the market, so you're just gonna have to generalize from what you saw here to your situation and make changes as necessary.